The grand lobby of Crestwood Hall hummed with a very specific kind of energy. It was the nervous, glittering buzz of a classical music recital, where ambition was worn as openly as silk and sequins. Well-dressed people stood in small clusters, their conversations a low murmur of practiced compliments and subtle comparisons. Parents adjusted the bow ties of young prodigies, their smiles tight with hope and investment. This was not just a concert. It was a showcase, a battleground for future fame, and everyone knew their place. Near a large potted fern, trying to become part of its shadow, stood a woman. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a simple navy blue dress that had seen better seasons. It was neat, but it spoke of practicality, not fashion. Her hands, resting at her sides, were her most notable feature, slender and strong, with long fingers that had a slight permanent curve, as if always ready to find a keyboard. Her name was Alara, and she was tonight's hired accompanist. She had been hired 2 weeks prior by the mother of a flautist, a teenage girl with very expensive braces and a case of nerves that made her lip tremble. Alara's job was simple: play the piano part for the girl's performance of a Mozart sonata, provide a solid, invisible foundation, and collect her modest fee at the end of the night. It was a transaction. She was a piece of the evening's necessary machinery, like the stagehand who moved the chairs or the person who tuned the grand piano. Before the doors opened, no one spoke to her. She didn't mind. She watched the crowd with quiet, observant eyes. She saw the proud grandparents beaming, the rival teachers sizing up each other's students, the wealthy patrons who donated to the hall and expected a certain caliber of talent. Her own small purse, containing a tissue, a single house key, and her sheet music was clutched gently in her hands. The center of the room's gravity was a man with a sweep of silver hair and a face carved by a lifetime of stern concentration. Maestro Alistair Thorne. He was a legend, a conductor and pianist whose approval could launch a career and whose frown could end one. He held court, accepting handshakes and nods of deference. His eyes, sharp and critical, scanned the young performers, already assessing, already judging. They passed right over Alara, as if she were a section of the wallpaper. To him, she was staff, background, unremarkable. A young man in a slightly too large tuxedo, the evening's organizer, rushed past her, clipboard in hand. "Flute is fourth, right?" "You're with the flute?" he asked without stopping. "Yes," Alara said, her voice soft. "Green room is down the hall to the left. Be ready. Don't be late." And he was gone, already calling out to someone more important. Alara made her way down the corridor. The green room was a chaos of last-minute panic. A boy was frantically practicing a rapid scale on a silent keyboard on his lap. A girl was having the hem of her dress pinned by her mother. The air smelled of hairspray and rosin. Alara found a quiet corner on a worn sofa and placed her purse beside her. She took out her music, the Mozart flute sonata, and looked over it, though she knew it by heart. It was a habit, a ritual of focus. The flautist, her charge for the evening, spotted her. "You're my pianist?" the girl asked, her voice high with anxiety. "I am," Alara smiled, a warm, calming smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, which held a deeper, more distant calm. "Just breathe. Listen for my introduction, and we'll walk through it together. I'll be right with you." The girl nodded, somewhat reassured by Alara's quiet competence, then turned back to her mother for more reassurance. Alara put the music away. She didn't need it. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen. She could hear the faint sounds of the first performer from the hall, the clear, precise notes of a Chopin prelude, played with technical perfection, but a certain youthful stiffness. She could almost see the notes in her mind, the phrasing, the places where a little more rubato, a little more breath, would have given its soul. But that wasn't her job. Her job was to be a support, a foundation. When it was time, she followed the flautist to the wings of the stage. They stood in the darkness, watching the current performer take their bow. The applause was polite, encouraging. The stage lights were bright and hot. Alara felt no nerves for herself. This was just a task to be completed. A piece of music to be played correctly, in time, and with enough feeling to support the soloist, but not so much as to ever draw attention to herself. From the wings, she could see the edge of the audience. She saw Maestro Thorn in the front row, his arms crossed, his head tilted in analytical judgment. He gave a slow, single nod to the departing performer, a grade of sufficient. Her flautist trembled beside her. "Remember to breathe," Alara whispered again, her own hands hanging loose and ready at her sides. They were announced. The girl walked out first, to a smattering of applause. Alara followed, her steps quiet, her head slightly bowed. She took her seat at the magnificent grand piano, a gleaming black beast under the lights. She adjusted the bench just so, a small, practiced movement. She placed her hands in her lap and waited for the girl to get ready. The performance was fine. The flute notes were sometimes airy, the rhythm in one spot rushed, but Alara was there, a steady, reliable presence. Her accompaniment was flawless, supportive, responsive, subtly covering the small flutters with the richness of the piano's harmonies. She was the soil from which the flute's melody could grow. When they finished, the applause was warm, mostly for the smiling young girl. Alara stood, gave the briefest, most modest of nods toward her partner and the audience, and walked off the stage, back into the shadows. She returned to the green room while the next performer got ready. She sat back on the sofa, her part done. She would wait until the end, collect her envelope with the cash fee from the organizer, and take the late bus home. The recital flowed on around her. She was once again invisible, a modest woman in a simple dress, her purpose for the evening fulfilled. No one glanced her way. She was a comma in the evening's long sentence, already read and passed over. In the bright, busy world of Crestwood Hall, Alara Vance had once again successfully disappeared. The recital sailed on, a ship navigating the predictable, if sometimes choppy, waters of youthful talent. Alara sat quietly on the green room sofa, her hands folded in her lap. The nervous energy in the room had a rhythm to it now, a peak of anxiety, just before a performer went on, a crash of relief or disappointment when they returned. She watched it like a gentle tide. She allowed her mind to wander, just a little. The fee for tonight, tucked soon into her purse, would cover her utilities for the month. It was a practical thought, a small stone of security. The grand piano on stage, a beautiful instrument, had a slightly bright tone in the upper register, she'd noticed. The bench was a touch low for her liking, but she'd made it work. The young organizer, his forehead permanently creased with the weight of the event, hurried past her, counting heads. Violin, then the Chopin Ballade, then intermission, he muttered to himself, ticking items on his clipboard. From the hall, the sound of a violin scraping through a difficult passage caused a few people in the green room to wince. Alara's eyes closed for a second. She could almost feel the student's panic, the tightening of the bow grip. Her left hand, resting on her knee, twitched almost imperceptibly, as if fingering a correct note on an invisible fingerboard. Then a new kind of sound cut through the backstage murmur. It was a harsh, ragged breathing. It came from a boy sitting in the corner, hunched over. He was the one scheduled to play the Chopin Ballade right before intermission, a towering, difficult piece meant to be the evening's showstopper. His face, usually proud and confident, was the color of chalk. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. He was trying to flex his hands, but the fingers were stiff, locked into clumsy claws. His teacher, A woman with a severe bun and a concerned frown knelt beside him. Just breathe through it. It's only nerves. You know this piece inside and out. The boy shook his head, a quick, frantic motion. I can't feel my fingers, he whispered, the words choked with terror. I look at the music and the notes. They're just black dots. They don't mean anything. A tear of pure frustration traced a path through the powder on his cheek. This was more than stage fright. This was a full-scale mutiny of the mind and body, a collapse under the immense weight of expectation. The teacher's attempts to soothe him only seemed to make him shrink further into himself. The violinist on stage finished to tepid applause. The organizer peeked through the curtain to the hall, then back at the scene in the green room. His eyes darted from the stricken boy to the clock on the wall. We're on in 3 minutes, he hissed, his voice a tight wire of stress. For the intermission, panic, cold and communicable, began to spread. The flautist's mother, who had hired Alara, clucked her tongue sympathetically. Poor thing. The pressure on these children is dreadful. The organizer ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing up in frantic spikes. He couldn't send the boy out there. It would be a car crash, a humiliation for the student, and an embarrassment for the Crestwood. But an empty stage? A canceled performance right before intermission? The program would be ruined. The audience, buzzing with the promise of the grand Chopin, would be left confused and dissatisfied. Donors would raise eyebrows. His gaze, sharp with desperation, swept the room. It passed over the younger siblings, the anxious parents, the other students who were up later and were now paralyzed with their own second-hand fear. Then it landed on the sofa, on the woman in the navy dress, sitting with a stillness that seemed out of place in the brewing storm. Ilara, the accompanist. She could play. She had hands. She was an adult, presumably less likely to fall apart. He strode over, clipboard clamped to his chest like a shield. You're the pianist for the flute. Ilara looked up, pulled from her quiet thoughts. Yes, the Chopin is off. He can't go on. The organizer jerked his thumb toward the boy, who was now being helped to drink a cup of water with trembling hands. We have a hole. A big one. Right before intermission. Ilara simply waited. She understood the problem. She didn't yet see her part in the solution. I need you to go on instead. Fill the time. 10, 12 minutes. His words were fast, tumbling out. It was not a request. It was an administrative solution. Play something. Nice. Something familiar. A few popular etudes. Some Debussy, maybe. Just keep it flowing. Keep it simple. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Asterisk, don't try to be impressive. Don't attempt the Chopin. Just be pleasant, musical wallpaper. Plug the gap. Asterisk, all eyes in the green room turned to her. The teacher looked at her with a mixture of hope and pity. The other students saw not a rescuer, but a placeholder. The flautist's mother gave a slight, encouraging nod, as if to say, asterisk, do your bit. Dear. Asterisk Ilara looked from the organizer's strained face to the boy, who was now crying quietly into his hands, his dream for the evening shattered. She felt an old, familiar feeling, a sense of being handed a task that was beneath what she could do, but was all anyone expected. A duty. What would you like me to play? She asked, her voice still that soft, calm instrument. The organizer blinked, frustrated. He hadn't thought that far. I don't know. Something from the standard repertoire. The easier Bach prelude. The one everyone knows. Just play. He was already turning away, his mind on calming the boy and managing the fallout. You're on after the applause for the violin dies down. Just walk out and play. He hurried off to deal with the next crisis, leaving Ilara with the assignment. Asterisk something nice. Something familiar. Keep it simple. Asterisk she sat for another moment. The sounds from the hall told her the violin piece was reaching its finale. She stood up. She didn't reach for any sheet music. She walked slowly to a small mirror on the wall and looked at her reflection, the modest dress, the face of a woman who was used to not being seen. For a fleeting second, something flickered in her deep-set eyes. Not fear, not excitement. Something more like a decision, quiet and final. She turned and walked towards the side of the stage, her footsteps silent on the carpet. The violinist took their bow. The applause rose and fell. The organizer, from the shadows of the wing, gave her a frantic, pushing gesture with his hand. Go. Now. Hilaire Vance smoothed the front of her old navy dress. She took a breath that wasn't for nerves, but for focus. Then she walked out of the darkness and into the bright, expectant silence of the stage. The silence in Crestwood Hall was not the quiet of anticipation, but of mild disappointment and confusion. The program had listed a formidable Chopin ballade before the intermission. Instead, a plainly dressed woman, the one who had earlier accompanied the flute, walked onto the stage. A few people exchanged puzzled glances. Some rustled their programs, searching for a last-minute change that wasn't printed. A low whisper traveled through the back rows. In the front seat, Maestro Alistair Thorne let out a slow, silent breath that was almost a sigh. This was filler, an administrative hiccup. He recognized the woman now, not as a person, but as a function, the accompanist. She had been competent, he supposed, in that earlier, forgettable duty. Now she was being used as a human placeholder, a musical bandage to cover a wound in the evening schedule. He settled back in his plush seat, his critical mind already shifting to a neutral patient mode. He would endure this. It would be simple, probably mediocre, and soon over. He folded his arms, his gaze polite but distant. Ilara reached the grand piano. The stage lights felt warmer now, more isolated, with all those eyes upon her, waiting for her to merely fill a hole in time. She adjusted the bench, the same small movement as before. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment, her head bowed. The audience saw a modest woman preparing to play. Something easy. But what they could not see was the landscape unfolding behind her eyes. It was not the easier Bach prelude the organizer had vaguely requested. It was not something nice or familiar. In the quiet of her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She was in a small, sunlit room from long ago, with dust motes dancing in the air. She was hearing a recording, scratchy and old, of a piece that had carved its way into her soul when she was just a girl. A piece of such depth and architectural grandeur that it felt less like music and more like a journey. Bach's Chaconne, a piece written for a single violin, a monument of sound built from one simple, recurring progression. A piece that spoke of loss, struggle, and a hard-won triumph, as she heard it not on a violin, but in the rich, full-bodied translation for piano, a version that demanded not just technique, but a lifetime of understanding to make it breathe. Her hands rose. They did not hover with theatrical tension. They simply settled over the keys, a homecoming. She played the first note. It was a deep, solid bass note, not struck, but placed. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into the soles of the listener's shoes. It was a statement, a question, the foundation stone of a cathedral. Then came the next notes, the beginning of the famous relentless chord progression. Her left hand established a pulse that was not a mere rhythm, but a heartbeat steady, inevitable, profound. Her right hand began to weave the melody above it. The sound was not the bright, tinkling piano they had heard all night. It was darker, richer, full of shadows and old wood. It was a voice speaking in a language older than words. The polite indifference in the hall evaporated in an instant. The rustling of programs stopped. Every whispered conversation died mid-sentence. Heads that had been tilted in boredom snapped up. It was as if the air itself had changed, becoming thicker, more charged. Maestro Thorne's folded arms loosened. He did not move forward dramatically, but his entire posture stiffened, as if he'd received a small, precise electric shock. His eyes, which had been half-lidded, opened wide. The polite, distant gaze was gone, replaced by a fierce, laser-focused intensity. He knew this piece. He knew its terrible, beautiful difficulty. He had heard the great pianists of the age attempt it. What was this? Alara played on. She was no longer a woman on a stage fulfilling a duty. She was a conduit. Her body moved with a natural, unforced grace, leaning into the phrases, her head giving a slight, unconscious tilt as the music moved from profound sorrow to a flicker of rebellion. Her face was calm, but alive with a deep, concentrated light. This was not performance. This was communion. The music built. It wasn't just the notes of Bach she was playing. It was a story. The listeners, even those who didn't know the piece, could feel it. They could hear the struggle in the dense, clashing harmonies that her hands wrestled into coherence. They could feel a soaring, aching lament in the singing high notes that seemed to hang weeping in the air. Then a passage of furious, intricate passagework, not played with flashy, arrogant speed, but with a clarity that made every single note a raindrop in a storm. It was controlled power. It was chaos mastered. In the green room, the organizer had been nervously chewing a fingernail. The sound reached him not as music, but as a force. He let his hand drop, his mouth slightly open. The crying boy had stopped. He was listening, his tear-streaked face blank with awe, his own forgotten Chopin suddenly seeming like child's play. The teacher with the severe bun stood frozen, one hand pressed to her chest. Back in the hall, no one coughed. No one moved. People forgot to breathe in time with the music, then remembered and drew in sharp, quiet breaths at a particularly beautiful resolution. An elderly man in the third row, who had been dozing lightly, was now fully awake, his rheumy eyes fixed on Ilara's flying hands, a tremor in his own aged fingers. And Maestro Thorne? He was a man dismantled. Every assumption he had made in the last hour, in the last decade, was crumbling. This was not competence. This was not even excellence. This was artistry of the highest, rarest order. He heard in her playing the ghosts of the great masters, the intellectual depth, the emotional torrent, the technical command that seemed effortless because it was so complete. He heard a lifetime. He heard years of solitary practice, of love poured into the wood and wire of an instrument when no one was listening. He heard joy, and he heard immense, quiet sorrow. He found himself leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his famous, stern face now a mask of naked astonishment. He watched her hands, those efficient, unadorned hands, as they performed miracles. They created waves of sound that washed over the hall, then drew back to a single, poignant line so fragile it might break. And through it all, that steady, heartbeat pulse in the left hand, the spine of the entire universe she was creating. Alara reached the final variations. The music, after its long journey through darkness and conflict, began to ascend. It grew brighter, more assured, moving toward a resolution that felt not like a simple happy ending, but like peace earned through a long battle. The final chords rang out, not as a bombastic finale, but as a series of deep, resonant affirmations, solid, complete, true. The last note faded into the absolute silence of the hall. Ilara's hands lowered slowly back to her lap. The connection was broken. The landscape behind her eyes receded. She was just a woman in a modest dress again, sitting at a piano on a stage that felt suddenly very large and very quiet. She had simply played. She had filled the time. But in doing so, she had not just played a piece of music. She had rewired the reality of everyone in the room. The stunned silence was not the absence of sound. It was the sound of a world being quietly, irrevocably, turned upside down. The silence that followed the last note was so complete, it had a weight of its own. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was packed with the echo of what had just happened, a sound so powerful it seemed to have vacuumed all the ordinary noise from the world. For a long moment, no one moved. The audience sat as if turned to stone, their faces tilted toward the stage, their minds still chasing the ghost of the music that had just finished rewriting the air. On stage, Elara took a slow, soft breath. The bright lights felt hot on her skin. The journey was over. The world she had built with her hands for the last 10 minutes dissolved, leaving the familiar, slightly shabby reality of the concert hall. She was aware of the hundreds of eyes on her, but the feeling was distant, like hearing thunder from far away. She hadn't played for them. She had simply answered the call of the music that had asked to be let out. Now that it was done, a small, familiar shyness returned. She wasn't a performer seeking applause. She was a woman who had finished a task. She stood up from the piano bench. The simple movement, so ordinary, seemed to break a spell. A single sharp clap rang out from the back of the hall. Then another. Then, like a dam giving way, the applause erupted. It wasn't the polite, measured clapping from earlier in the evening. This was a wave of sound, loud, fervent, and layered with shouts of bravo. It was a physical force that seemed to shake the old crystal of the chandeliers. Elara looked out, a little startled by the ferocity of it. She gave a small, uncertain nod, more of an acknowledgement than a bow. Her instinct was to leave, to slip back into the shadows from which she'd come. She took a step toward the side of the stage, but in the front row, Maestro Alistair Thorne was already in motion. The applause was a nuisance to him, a distraction. He needed it to stop. He needed to get to her. The shock on his face had been replaced by a kind of furious electric urgency. He knew music. He knew what was technically difficult and what was emotionally profound. What he had just heard was a once-in-a-generation convergence of both. And it had come from a ghost, a woman he had dismissed as part of the furniture. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He didn't care. He was a tall man, and his movement was so abrupt, it drew the eyes of those around him. He ignored them. He took not the aisle, but the most direct route stepping over the plush velvet ropes that separated the front row from the stage itself. It was a breach of every protocol, but he was beyond protocol. He reached the edge of the stage just as Elara was about to disappear into the wings. His voice, trained to project over 100-piece orchestra without a microphone, cut through the applause. Wait. The command, raw and resonant, silenced the hall again. All heads turned. The organizer, who had been rushing from the wings to perhaps usher Elara off, froze in place, his mouth agape. Elara stopped. She turned back, her expression one of mild surprise. She saw the famous maestro, his silver hair disheveled, his face pale with a kind of awe that looked almost like anger, standing right below the stage. Looking up at her, for a second, they just looked at each other. The whole hall held its breath. This was no longer part of the recital. This was something else entirely. Who are you? Thorne's question wasn't polite. It was a demand. It was the question of a man who believed he knew every significant pianist on the planet and had just discovered a hidden continent. Elara didn't answer immediately. The directness of the question, the intensity in his eyes, was overwhelming. She simply shook her head a little, a small, humble gesture that seemed to say, "It doesn't matter." But to Thorne, It was the only thing that mattered. That, he said, pointing a trembling finger at the piano, as if the instrument itself was the witness. That was not filler. He struggled for words, a man who was never at a loss for words. That was the chaconne, played not with skill, but with understanding. Where did you study? With whom? A murmur rippled through the audience. They were witnessing an interrogation, a discovery played out in real time. Elara's voice, when it came, was still soft, but it carried in the dead quiet. A long time ago, she said. That was all. Names. Thorne insisted, taking a step closer, his hands gripping the edge of the stage. I must know the names. From the side, the flautist's mother, her face flushed with a strange pride, called out helpfully, She's my daughter's accompanist. Her name is Elara Vance. Thorne didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on Elara. Vance, he repeated, as if tasting the name, trying to connect it to a memory, a lineage. It meant nothing to him. And that was impossible. You play like someone who stopped decades ago. But you never stopped. I can hear it. The practice is in your bones. Where have you been playing? This was the heart of it. Where had she been hiding? In what grand concert halls? On what famous stages? Elara looked down at her hands, then out at the sea of waiting faces. There was no pride in her gaze, only a quiet, tired truth. At home, she said, the simple words dropping into the silent hall. I play at home. The answer was so mundane, so devastatingly small, that it took a moment for its meaning to sink in. At home, not in Vienna, not in New York, not in competition halls. At home, Thorne stared, his mind racing, piecing together the puzzle. The modest dress, the quiet demeanor, the fact that she was for hire as an accompanist for a teenager's recital. The immense world-class talent married to absolute obscurity. It made no sense in the world he knew. But in another, older, more human world, it was starting to form a heartbreaking picture. A man in the audience, a local piano teacher, suddenly snapped his fingers. Vance, he said aloud, then clapped a hand over his mouth, embarrassed. But the seed was planted. Thorne heard it. He turned his fierce gaze on the man. You know this name? The piano teacher stood up, nervous but excited to contribute to the mystery. I think I remember. From a long time back. There was a child. A prodigy, 35, maybe 40 years ago. She won everything. The big national competition when she was just 12. They said she was the next great one. Then, she just vanished from the programs. People thought she'd burned out or moved abroad. Every word was a brick, building a wall around the woman on stage. Elara did not confirm or deny. She just stood there, a faint, sad smile touching her lips, as if remembering a story about someone else. Thorne looked back at her, and in his eyes, the last pieces fell into place. The vanished prodigy. The playing that spoke of a lifetime of depth, not of a career of fame. The hands that served the music, not an audience. He didn't see a failed musician. He saw a sacrifice. He saw a life where the music had not died, but had been forced to live a quiet, secret life, practiced in lonely rooms while the world outside moved on. He saw duty. He saw choices made for others, not for oneself. The chaconne she had played was a piece about struggle and resilience, and now he understood it was also her story. The anger, the urgency, drained from his face. What remained was something much softer, a profound, unsettling respect, tinged with a kind of grief for the lost years. The maestro, the great judge of talent, felt judged himself by her quiet dignity, by the sheer scale of what had been overlooked. He stepped back from the stage, his movements slower now. He gave a small, deep nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, of an apology to the music itself for letting this one slip by. The spell was broken. The audience, now buzzing with the exploded secret, began to applaud again, but it was different now. It was charged with understanding, with a collective, breathless wonder. Alara, seeing her chance, gave one last, small nod to the room, to the maestro, and then turned and walked off the stage. This time no one stopped her. She disappeared into the dark of the wings, leaving behind a hall ringing with the sound of her absence, and a great man standing alone before an empty piano, knowing he had just witnessed a quiet earthquake. The green room was no longer a waiting room. It was the stunned aftermath of a lightning strike. When Alara stepped back into its warmth from the dark of the wings, the silence inside was deeper than the one in the hall. Every face was turned to her, the young performers, the parents, the teacher, the ashen boy who had been unable to play. They stared as if she had shed a skin and revealed something else beneath. The organizer stood by the water cooler, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side. Alara felt the weight of their gazes, a physical pressure. The distant focus she had felt on stage was gone, replaced by a familiar, shy discomfort. She offered a small, tight smile, a silent plea for normalcy that went unanswered. She walked back to her corner of the worn sofa, her steps seeming too loud in the quiet. She picked up her modest purse, the ordinary object feeling strange in her hands, which still hummed with the ghost of the batch. Before she could sit, the boy who had frozen approached her. His eyes were red-rimmed, but wide with a new kind of awe, not for himself, but for her. That was. He began, his voice cracking. He shook his head, unable to finish. "Thank you," he finally whispered. It wasn't just for filling his slot. It was for showing him what music could truly be. The flautist's mother rushed over, her earlier polite condescension replaced by a fluttery, possessive excitement. "My dear, I had no idea. Why on earth are you playing for hire? You should be asterisk recorded." Asterisk. Her words tumbled out, painting a future of recital halls and record deals in the air. Alara just shook her head gently. "I was happy to help," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. It was all she would offer. She wasn't interested in the future. They were already scripting for her. She wanted the envelope with her fee and the quiet walk to the bus stop. But the door to the green room opened. Maestro Thorne stood there. He had come through the back corridors. His presence immediately sucked all the oxygen from the room. The excited chatter died instantly. He wasn't looking at anyone but her. "A word, please," he said. It was not a request from a celebrity, but the grave appeal of one colleague to another. She nodded. He held the door open for her, and she followed him out into a quieter, narrow hallway lined with framed posters of past concerts. The sounds of the intermission crowd, a buzzing hive of excited conversation about her, filtered in from the lobby. But here it was muted. Thorne didn't speak immediately. He looked at her, really looked, as if studying a complex score. The stern authority was gone. In its place was a weary, profound curiosity. "They said you vanished," he began, his voice low. "The child prodigy." Alara leaned slightly against the cool wall. She looked at her hands. "I didn't vanish. I just went home." She took a slow breath. "My mother became ill. Then my father. There was no one else." She stated it plainly, without a trace of self-pity. It was simply history. "Then later, my husband. He was sick for a very long time." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "The piano. It was always there. It was my place. But the stage? That was for another life." Thorne listened, nodding slowly. He heard the decades in those few sentences. The practicing at night, after long days of care. The pieces learned not for judges, but for the solace of their own structure. The slow, deep embedding of music into the soul when its only audience was the four walls of the sick room. It explained everything the technical mastery, fused with a depth of feeling no conservatory could ever teach. The world lost something, he said, and it sounded like a confession. The world got along just fine, she replied with a faint, sad smile. I lost nothing. I had the music. It just lived in a smaller house. He was silent for a long moment, absorbing the humility of that. He, who fought for spotlight and legacy, couldn't fathom it. Yet he had just heard the proof of it. And now? He finally asked, They are gone? Yes, and you play for students. For small fees. It's honest work, she said. It keeps the music in my hands. It pays the rent for the small house. Thorne shook his head, a sudden fierce light returning to his eyes. No. The words came out with force. It is not honest. Not anymore. Not after what you just did in there. He gestured toward the hall. To hide a light like that, it is no longer a quiet life. It is a theft. From the music itself. Elara flinched, but he pressed on, softer now. I am not asking you to tour. I am not asking for a comeback. I am telling you, as a musician who has listened for a lifetime, that you have a responsibility that has nothing to do with fame. You have something to say. You have already said it, tonight, without meaning to. You cannot unsay it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple business card, thick and cream-colored. He held it out to her. My private studio. Next Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. There will be no audience. Just 2 pianos. Come and play. Not for me. For the sake of the thing you love. Play the way you play when you are at home. Elara looked at the card, then at his earnest, insistent face. This was not an offer of pity. It was a challenge. A recognition so deep it was intimidating. The quiet, ordered life she had built for herself. The simple cycle of practice. Teaching, accompaniment, and solitude teetered on the edge of something vast and unknown out in the lobby. The buzzer sounded for the end of intermission. The second half of the recital would begin, but everyone knew the main event was already over. She reached out and took the card. Her fingers, which had conjured a universe minutes before, trembled just slightly. I will think about it, she said. It was not a promise. But it was not a refusal. Thorne accepted this with a slow nod. It was enough. For now, he turned and walked back down the hall, leaving her alone with the muffled sounds of the returning audience and the weight of the card in her hand. Later, as the final notes of the recital's official program faded, no one really heard them. Elara collected her envelope from the stammering organizer. He tried to offer more, but she refused. She took only what was agreed. She stepped out of the stage door into the cool night air. The city sounds greeted her, the rumble of a distant bus, the chatter of people leaving the hall, talking excitedly about the woman who played the batch. They didn't recognize her in her plain coat. Just another person in the crowd. She walked to her bus stop, the card a small, hard rectangle in her pocket. She thought of her quiet apartment, her own well-worn piano, the peaceful routine of tomorrow. It was a good life, a safe life. But as she stood there waiting, she replayed not the applause, not the maestro's intense face, but the feeling of those first few minutes on stage. The moment when the music had chosen her, and for the first time in decades, she had let it out into the world, not just into a room. The silence that had followed had not been empty. It had been alive. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes and a glow of warm light. The doors opened. Elara Vance put her hand in her pocket, her fingers brushing the edge of the maestro's card. She took a breath, stepped up into the bus, and found a seat by the window. As the city lights began to slide past, she realized the melody she had played tonight, the one that had left the maestro stunned, was not an ending. It had been a question. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she was quietly, tremulously, beginning to consider an answer.